Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third and final day of Africa-Asia, Overlooked Histories of Exchange. My name is Emma Stein, and I'm Assistant Curator of South and Southeast Asian Art at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art, the Freer and Sackler Galleries. This symposium is truly international and collaborative at its core, intended to realign our understandings of the connections between Africa, Asia, and the pathways and places in between. It's co-organized by the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art and National Museum of Asian Art, with support from a One Smithsonian grant. Together with the more than 700 people who have registered for the symposium around the world, beginning Monday, our participants have been exploring the entangled histories between African and Asian spaces from antiquity to the present. If you have not been able to join us for the first 2 days, please know that the event is being recorded and the talks will be available on the YouTube channels of both museums soon. Before we begin today's program, a word about the technical features of this Zoom webinar. To submit a question, please click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. A window will appear where you can type your question. We likely won't have time to answer all of them today, but please know that we'll be saving the question box and are especially appreciative of your input as we carry this project forward. You're also welcome to write to us with questions or comments after the program at the email address in the chat. We welcome your insights. Please be aware that our team will use the chat to post additional information throughout the program, including extended speaker biographies and links to related projects. You can use the gray line in the middle of your screen to make either the presentation or the speaker bigger, depending on your own preference. To use closed captioning, click the CC icon below and text will appear on the bottom of the screen. I'd like to thank the Smithsonian Office of the Provost for making this symposium possible, especially as we translated what would have been an in-person gathering into a much larger multinational opportunity. This involved creativity and some leaps of faith by our core planning team, which included my colleagues at the National Museum of Asian Art, Sana Mirza, and National Museum of African Art, Christine Mullen-Kramer and Karen Milbourne. Other faces making this symposium come to life include Lizzie Stein, who is administering the chat and many hidden logistics, Cal Holderbaum and Brandon Pugh running tech, and Claire Baldy for captioning. We'd also like to recognize the support of the National Museum of Asian Art's Director, Chase Robinson, and Deputy Director, Masame Farhad, as well as Deborah Mack, the Interim Director of the National Museum of African Art. And now to today's program. On Monday and Tuesday, we considered the dynamic locations and remarkable individuals whose stories evidence realignments of power structures and axes of travel, growth, and exchange. In the course of the presentations, many objects and artworks were discussed. Today, we dive deeper into the objects, the tangible traces of these historical connections and interstitial spaces like islands, coastlines, and international waters. Our speakers include art historians Ruth Barnes, Iftikhar Dadi, and Ruth Simbao, with a response by Finbarr Barry Flood, followed by time for questions from you, the audience. Together, the presentations will draw attention to both the overlooked treasures of history and the insightful works being created by artists today. So let me introduce our first speaker. Ruth Barnes is the Thomas Jaffe Curator of Indo-Pacific Art at the Yale University Art Gallery. She received her doctorate from Oxford University and was previously textile curator at the Ashmolean Museum. Her publications include the Ikat textiles of La Melara and Indian block printed textiles in Egypt, the Newberry collection in the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford. Her book, 5 Centuries of Indonesian Textiles, co-edited with Mary Kalenberg, received the Textile Society of America's R.L. Shep Award in 2010. So Ruth, welcome, and please begin your presentation.
Okay. Ships of plenty, the trade between the Arab Peninsula, East Africa, and Western India. Interregional trade in the Western Indian Ocean goes back to at least the beginning of the second millennium BCE. There's ample evidence for contact between Mesopotamia and the Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley in the form of seals, inscriptions, and pottery finds. The sea trade through the Persian Gulf was active in both directions, with Indian ships visiting Mesopotamia, while Mesopotamian boats traveled the coast of Persia to the mouth of the Indus. The myrrh and frankincense used in Old Kingdom Egypt and elsewhere in the Mediterranean may mainly have come via the land route through the deserts of Arabia. A major source for the tree resins was in Eastern Arabia, east of Wadi Hadramat and in the present-day Dhofar. However, there are records for expeditions in search of myrrh and frankincense to the land of Punt from Egypt as early as 2400 BC. Punt is usually identified with Somalia, although it may have been closer to Egypt on the Egyptian side of the Red Sea. As the major source for frankincense was Southern Arabia, the connection with East Africa, from Egypt's point of view at least, may actually imply that in addition to the caravan routes across Arabia, a certain amount of the aromatic resins went from the ports of southeastern Arabia, present-day Yemen, first to East Africa and then traveled on to Egypt. The early navigation was apparently dominated by Arabs and Indians, with a certain degree of participation by Phoenician sailors as well. When Egypt became part of the Roman Empire under Augustus, the economic expansion led to the development of direct trade links between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, with much of the commerce going through the Red Sea. A key reference to the trade of the time remains the periplus of the Erythraean Sea. Now, a periplus usually provides navigational information, but in this particular document, this seems to have been compiled by a merchant who was traveling in the Western Indian Ocean. The manuscript provides fairly detailed lists of goods and merchandise supplied by the different coastal regions. The African trade from the Red Sea to Somalia concentrated on the export of ivory, tortoiseshell, slaves, from frankincense and some myrrh, the latter two originally from Southern Arabia. Some cassia, which is cinnamon, was also picked up in East Africa, although much of it actually would have originated in Southeast Asia, which is a remarkable indication of far-reaching trade connections at this very early time. From Southern Arabia, especially the eastern port of Qanaa, came frankincense, myrrh, and aloe. The frankincense trade, which supported the ancient empires of Southern Arabia and brought them great wealth, was clearly government controlled, as the periplus indicates. And I quote, "Qanaa belongs to the kingdom of Iliosos, which means the Hadramaut in present-day Eastern Yemen, the frankincense-bearing which is the frankincense-bearing land. Above it is inland lies the metropolis of Saubata, which is the present-day Shabwa, which is also the residence of the king. All the frankincense grown in the land is brought into Qanaa, as if to a warehouse. The goods that were exported from India to Rome were of the greatest variety. There were spices and aromatics, textiles, especially cotton, gems, ivory, pearls, and again, tortoiseshell. The Arab and Indian navigators eventually recognized the advantage of the regular monsoon shifts in the Indian Ocean, which meant predictable wind and current directions for the annual seasons, and hence opportunities for easier and faster journeys across open waters. But this happened clearly only after the decline of the Roman trade with the Indian Ocean communities at some time around the middle of the first millennium CE. The settling of Madagascar by people from Western maritime Southeast Asia is of particular interest in this respect. It has been suggested that the boats already utilized the regular monsoon change and that they arrived by cross-sea navigation rather than coastal travels. It is possible that the Southeast Asians were directly involved in the early spice trade. Often quoted here is a reference in Pliny's Natural History, where he dismissed the fanciful stories of the origin of Asian spices, supposedly found in dangerous swamps guarded by bats, and instead described traders who carried their goods over the wide sea in ships that are neither steered by rudders nor propelled by oars. Hornell, the navigational scholar, interpreted these boats as Southeast Asian outrigger vessels, as famously depicted on the 8th century CE reliefs of Borobudur in central Java, a major Buddhist monument. By the mid-first millennium, Karna seems to have lost its importance as a port, and the trade shifted to Aden. For the late Roman and Byzantine occupation of Egypt, there is very little evidence for direct contact with the Indian Ocean trade via the Red Sea. And let me just return to the map. The rise of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and merchant centers at Basra and along the Persian Gulf brought intense and far-ranging contacts with India and China, while the Western Islamic world remained only indirectly in contact with the maritime trade of Asia at this time. As finds at Old Cairo, called Fustat, have shown, Egypt certainly received goods from South and East Asia, ceramics from China, precious stones from India, and spices from Southeast Asia, but these came primarily, apparently, via the Persian Gulf. A major shift occurred with the rise of the North African Fatimid dynasty in the 10th century. From this period onwards, the close trade relationship between Egypt and East Africa, Arabia, and Western India became historical fact rather than speculation, with a wealth of documents surviving from the 10th and 11th century onwards. Some of these were travelers' reports, such as the Chinese Chao Zhukua, who referred to the trade between Gujarat, Northwest India, and Arabia in the 12th and 13th century, and I quote, "The native products comprise great quantities of indigo, myrobalan, which is used in modern dyeing, very important in the Indian cotton production, and foreign cotton stuffs of every color." And I'm showing you a block printed cotton fragment that is now in the large collection in the Ashmolean Museum that I had the privilege to work with. And here's a second example. Chadrukua concludes, every year these goods are transported to the Tachi, which means Arab or Persian countries, for sale. Marco Polo, to quote a European source, gives a fairly detailed account of the port of Aden on his return from East Asia. This Aden is the port to which many of the ships of India come with their cargoes, and from this haven, the merchants carry the goods a distance of 7 days further in small vessels. This, of course, refers to the trade through the Red Sea and eventually overland to Cairo. He continues, and you must know that the Sultan of Aden receives a large amount of duties from the ships that travel between India and his country. And from the exports, also he gets a revenue, for there are dispatched from Aden to India a very large number of Arab chargers, that is horses, which are a source of great profit. Now, the Fatimid court and urban elite supported a remarkable rise in artistic production. Many of the objects used had a foreign origin in material, foremost East Africa and India. Rock crystal, which was very popular for producing luxury vessels and other beautiful objects, and ivory from East Africa and precious stones from India were turned into prestigious items. Silk weaving and fibers imported from Byzantium, sometimes further adorned with gold leaf, were turned into luxury textiles. Egyptian flax was woven into the finest linen, further embroidered with silk thread. Who were the merchants who traded these goods, and how did they move about in the world of the Western Indian Ocean? The major source for the trade between India, Southern Arabia, and Egypt comes from the 11th and 12th century, from a huge, if mostly fragmentary, cache of written documents found in the late 19th century in the synagogue of a Jewish community based in Fustat, Old Cairo, now deserted and turned into Cairo's waste disposal site. At the time, a restoration, that is in the late 19th century, a restoration of the building revealed a large sealed-off chamber, a so-called Geniza, where letters, legal documents, religious writings, and miscellanea were ritually deposited because they had a reference to God. Apart from their religious significance, these papers and parchments held a wealth of information about the social makeup, everyday life, and professional activities of this particular community. Much of the material was analyzed by the historian Goitein, who managed to put together a remarkable social and economic history of life in the Jewish community. Many of the men were merchants who traveled widely in the Mediterranean and in the Western Indian Ocean. Their letters home to their wives and families give ample evidence for their travels and endeavors, as well as the goods they traded in. For the trade in the Western Indian Ocean, the so-called India trade, Goitein published an initial survey of 311 relevant papers and found the following 77 items that were transferred to Cairo from Arabia, East Africa, and India. Some of them obviously with their source further east. And I quote from Goitein: there were spices, aromatics, dyeing and varnishing plants, and medical herbs, a total of 36 cargo items. Iron and steel, 6 items. Brass and bronze vessels, 12 items. Indian silk and other textiles made mainly from cotton, 8 items. Pearls, beads, cowrie shells, and ambergris, 4 items. shoes and other leatherwork, 2 items, Chinese porcelain, Yemeni stone pots and ivory, African ivory items, 3, tropical fruit such as coconut, 5 items, and finally 1 item of timber. Goitein explains the makeup of this list, in particular the large presence of spices, dyestuffs, and medical herbs, by referring to the professions Jews were specially involved in, that is, as pharmacists, perfumers, and dyers. It also seems relevant, though, that the Indian port where these items were picked up was Calicut in present-day Kerala, which was a recipient of goods coming from Southeast Asia. Had the port of trade been in Gujarat, there would have been a far greater presence of cotton textiles, but fewer spices. Goitein's initial survey has since been greatly expanded by the publication of his India book, edited and further analyzed by his student Mordechai Friedman. Not only gives this great publication much more detail of the goods traded, but it also has detailed accounts in letter form of the nature of business transactions. Furthermore, it provides vivid accounts of the dangers and difficulties the merchants encounter in their sea journeys. The Jewish traders usually traveled in convoys of boats for safety against pirates and support in bad weather. By the 14th century, a well-organized merchants class had emerged in Egypt, the Karimi traders, who Goitein compared in influence to the Northern European Hanseatic League, although the Karimi never actually formed an official affiliation. They were described by Ibn Battuta, who traveled to Aden in about 1330, after he had been to pilgrimage to Mecca. He reports, Aden is an exceedingly hot place. It is the port of the Indians, and to it come large vessels from Cambay, Ceylon, Calicut, and other Malabar ports. Its inhabitants are all either merchants, porters, or fishermen. Some of the merchants are immensely rich, so rich that sometimes a single merchant is the sole owner of a large ship with all its contents. The immensely rich merchants clearly were the Karimi, powerful families of traders who dominated the economic relations between Egypt, East Africa, and India in the 13th and 14th centuries. They were all Muslims, although they may have been converts from Judaism and Christianity. During the Mamluk period of influence over the Yemen, several harbor settlements on the Arabian side of the Red Sea became involved with the international trade. Among them, Mocha, Hodeida, and Luhaya. Luhaya now is a small fishing town with merely the ruins of merchants' houses from the 14th and 15th century. Now, I'm showing you here some of the stucco work that survives on the walls of these houses. Many of it actually may be closely related to some of the Indian textiles that were so important in as trade items. The trade of Mecca at the time moved through Jeddah, which distinguished the Mamluk period from early Islamic trade patterns that had depended primarily on the overland caravan route through Arabia. To conclude this historical overview, I want to consider briefly what material evidence we have for these exchanges, and if there may be artistic responses to outside influences. As I have been studying the trade in Indian textiles into the Islamic world, specifically to Egypt, their possible influence on local design is a question I have long pursued. There are some tantalizing hints, in particular in southern Arabia, in the Yemen, that may indicate a local response to the vibrant quality of Indian designs. In the town of Rada, which is the eastern part of present Yemen, there is a madrasa, an Islamic school, dated to the 16th century. And this photograph shows you an early photograph of the building, and then a restored version of the same mosque and school. The building was very successfully restored thanks to the involvement of the Dutch government and with support from the Aga Khan Foundation. And this restoration started in the early 1990s, I think, and was completed about 15 years ago. This building has an unusual mixture of patterns painted into the ceiling domes and blind niches. And I'm showing you a detail here. Several of these are really strikingly similar to Indian printed textiles. And I'm comparing the fragment on the right here to that central medallion shape in the ceiling detail. Another good example is a 14th century mosque in the town of Taiz, where the mosque has a door that includes a wooden panel that is clearly carved in Gujarat, possibly made to order for the mosque. And I'm comparing it to, again, to textiles with tree representations that were textiles that were traded from Gujarat and ended up in Egypt, but certainly traveled through the Yemen as well. To this day, Gujarati printed textiles are imported into Yemen and are worn by women as large body wraps. Finally, I have an amusing anecdote of how academic attitudes towards our different fields of study have changed over the last 30 years. When I started my research on the large Newberry collection of Indian trade textiles at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford in 1990, the collection of well over 1,200 textiles had remained unaccessioned for 45 years. As my colleague, James Allen, a renowned expert in Islamic metalware and ceramics, and at the time curator of the Islamic collections at the museum, said to me, "It never was clear to us who was to look after this collection. I know nothing about Indian textiles, but the material is in my department because it was traded to Egypt. And our Indian curator, Andrew Topsfield, does not feel it is under his curatorship because it has left South Asia." So I was given a wonderful opportunity because I was willing to move between different cultures. At the time, in the early 1990s, the department also had a very large, ornately carved wooden door in its storage space. This was made in India. It had been transported across the Indian Ocean and into the Red Sea, where it became part of a merchant's house in Jeddah. It also had an interesting personal story. It was found in situ by T.E. Lawrence, who may be better known to many of you as Lawrence of Arabia. He was a British archaeologist and army officer who wholeheartedly supported the Arab rebellion against the Ottoman Empire during World War I. T.E. Lawrence acquired the door from the merchant and brought it back to England, where it was displayed next to his swimming pool at his home. It had come to the Ashmolean Museum as part of his bequest to Oxford after his death. But as a hybrid, it was not considered worth displaying. Now, finally, in 2008-9, the Ashmolean had changed its position and was actively encouraging cross-cultural connections. I became curator at the time for the new Asian Crossroads Gallery, and the T.E. Lawrence door now finally found a display space taking a prominent position in that gallery. Now, a decade later, these objects that moved between cultures find themselves at the very center of an international symposium at the Smithsonian. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for bringing us into this vast network of objects, merchants, and their travels, and especially for drawing attention to the shifting attitudes of scholars and museums towards these liminal kinds of objects. Our next speaker, Iftikhar Dadi, is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of History of Art and Director of the South Asia Program at Cornell University. He researches modern and contemporary art from a global and transnational perspective, with an emphasis on questions of methodology and intellectual history. His publications include Modernism and the Art of Muslim South Asia, the edited monograph Anwar Jalal Shemza, the co-edited catalog Lines of Control, and the co-edited reader Unpacking Europe. Iftikhar, please take the stage.
Thank you, Emma. I'll now begin to share my screen. Let's see how that works. So I'll jump now into the mid-20th century, and I really talk about the relation between decolonization of much of Asia and Africa and its relation to artistic form. And so my contention is that modernism is consolidated with reference to this process of decolonization in the decades following the Second World War. Questions of sovereignty and political independence are reflected in the works of artists from the region who create an aesthetic that ventures beyond folklore, beyond stasis and realism, and instead embraces multiplicity, transformation, and abstraction. Modernism in the region develops across multiple trajectories, which include study and travel in the Western world, South-to-South exchanges, and a perception of decolonization that extend beyond nationalism. So this presentation focuses on two exemplary figures whom I have done work on, Anwar Jalal Shemza and Ibrahim Al-Salahi, who both studied at the Slade in the later 1950s, and in fact they overlapped for several years during their years at the Slade, and who both kind of, in a sense, dealt with analogous concerns in their career. Now, what I understand in terms of the larger argument about modernism is that it is, I argue, inherently transnational. And the reason I argue this is that when European artists from the mid-19th century begin to abandon European perspectival paintings and seek aesthetic inspiration from the rest of the world, which includes movements such as Impressionism and Post-Impressionism and its relation to the Japanese print, Gauguin and Primitivism, Picasso and West African sculpture, Klee and Matisse and Islamic art, and the three founders of abstraction, usually the ones usually cited, which is Malevich, Mondrian, and Kandinsky, who are also interested in anthroposophy and theosophy. And what this results is the development of an aesthetic that is globalizing, in which artists from the rest of the world also participate. This is a universalist project as well, in which the experience of an individual is transformed into a utopian aesthetic product. But of course, one can never fully sublimate the specificity of the place from where it begins. So in that sense, modernism is one in the sense of its universal claim and its global reach, and in the sense that we can adjudicate work based on values that are universalist. But equally, it is also infinitely differentiated within, because it depends on the multifarious trajectories by which artists arrive at their own practice. These multiple projects create new aesthetic linkages between the decolonizing regions of the global South. So both Al-Salahi and Shamsa were fellow travelers in their physical trajectories, in their study at the Slade during the later 50s, but also in their subsequent development as artists who situated their own practice with reference to their respective legacies, one of which is also their belonging to the larger Muslim world in which the Arabic script is used. First, let's look at Ibrahim Al-Salahi's painting, The Last Sound, which is executed on a square canvas with a palette of gray and earth tones, and is organized around a central circular dynamic core. Radiant lines thrust outward from a barely perceptible African mask-like form. Celestial bodies, elements of calligraphic, geometric and animate shapes, and actual palimpsest like calligraphic prayers surround the central form, which would be here. Creating a metaphoric universe in which the last sound is echoed. The title refers to the Islamic practice of reciting prayers for the dead and the dying. And so in this work, we see the rendering of the soul's passage from the corporeal to the celestial as it travels towards heavenly forms inhabiting the universe and beyond, and in which the terrifying event is done up in a metaphor and in a dynamic formal composition. Here, the abstraction of African sculptural forms in calligraphy serves to universalize the event. No realist or academic visual language would obviously be adequate to the transcendental scope of the subject. The relation Al-Salahi creates between African abstract forms and calligraphy is itself invokes a gravitas of the theme. Now, Salahi arrived at this aesthetic actually through an intense process of experimentation that began from his Slade years onwards. Earlier, Salahi and Shamsa were at the Slade School in London during the late 50s, and both had become painfully aware of the marginal status accorded to Islamic art in the public lectures delivered by the celebrated art historian Ernst Gombrich. And in the late 60s, by the late 50s and the early 60s, the failure of academic painting to break out of the narrow salon and gallery exhibition circuit in Khartoum, where Salahi had moved back from after studying at the Slade, and the question of engaging with a more democratic and vernacular visual culture impelled Al-Salahi towards a more radical aesthetic shift. As he describes this transformation demanded breaking open the Arabic letter and exploring the new aesthetic universe that emerged from the fragments and from its interstices. Fracturing the Arabic letter also broke the classical calligraphic text as a repository of received meaning. This is evident in a series of paintings that whose titles are "They Always Appear," which signify the emergence of figural forms among the shapes defined by the figure-ground relationship of abstracted calligraphic shapes. I already showed you the statements by the artists. So I'll continue. Here is another print that he makes. This is a print, which is the River Nile. Al-Salahi's experiments thus resulted in an abstraction that was regional yet modernist, and that referred to a vast ensemble of iconic and textual material, traversing the Arabic and Islamic writing traditions, discursive traditions, as well as West African iconography. While Salahi's contribution is distinctive in developing an aesthetic of decolonization for Sudan and indeed for much of Africa, because he was also active and influential on West African artists, it can be usefully compared with other modernist artists from South and West Asia who were engaged with similar cultural problems in the wake of decolonization in the mid-20th century. I now turn to my next case study, which is Anwar Jalal Shamsa, who is representative of a generation of artists. He's the same generation as Salahi. He lived in the UK from the mid-50s until his death in 1985. He was born in India in Shimla to a Kashmiri and Punjabi family who at that time owned a carpet and military embroidery business. He studied high school in Lahore. After a year of reading, university reading philosophy, Persian and Arabic, he decided to become an artist and joined the Mayo School of Art in 1944. Upon his graduation in 1947, he set up a design studio. The trauma of the partition in the same year of colonial India into the post-colonial nation states of India and Pakistan saw the killing of many of his family members, a memory that continued to haunt him throughout his life. Shamsa then moved in 1956 to study at the Slade School of Fine Art, so arriving a year later than Al-Salahi. During the late 40s and the mid 50s, he was actually also associated with the circles of the literary intelligentsia. And he had contributed to this sphere by his writing and his organizational work. This is a time when literature, poetry, and fictional writing dominated Lahore's intellectual environment. So even while he was working on his art, he also participated very actively in this literary sphere. He published several novels in Urdu. These are three of his novels for which he designed the covers as well. He edited a literary journal, wrote and performed radio plays, and wrote poetry. But this is a time also when there was the literary sphere was actively contentious, and it was divided in basically three groups. One was the progressive writers who were leftist writers. The second was a group that was concerned with art for art's sake, or they called themselves the Harqa al-Bab-e-Zauq, which is the circle of aesthetes. And still there was another group which was kind of, in a sense, promoting a nationalist ideology. Much of this debate was between progressivism, or arts for life's sake, and modernism, which would be arts for art's sake. And the move towards painting for Shamsa needs to be situated accordingly as an affirmation of its metaphoric and larger potentialities, and in offering deeper insights into the self and society than the kind of reductive realism really that the progressives had increasingly embraced from the late 30s. So he was founder of a group of artists as well called the Lahore Art Circle, which is a group of young artists who aspire towards modernism and abstraction. The return from Europe of the artist Shakir Ali on the Lahore art scene in 1952 also decisively contributed to this gathering movement towards modernism. Now, when he moves to England, he is identified by Stuart Hall as part of the first generation of post-war Black British diaspora artists who arrive there. The first wave consisted of artists such as Francis Newton Sousa, Avinash Chandra, Frank Bowling, Aubrey William, Donald Block, Anwar Jalal Shamsa, and David Metella. And as Stuart Hall notes, the first generation was born in the 20s and 30s in the far-flung corners of the British Empire. They came to Britain as the last colonials in the 50s and 60s to fulfill their ambitions to become practicing artists. And they came to London in a spirit in which Picasso and others went to Paris to fulfill their ambitions and to participate in the heady atmosphere of the most advanced centers of artistic innovation at that time. The promise of decolonization fired their ambition, their sense of themselves as already modern persons. It liberated them from any lingering sense of inferiority. This is a quotation by Stuart Hall. However, far from being accepted as an equal, at the Slade, the Slade years actually marked the arrival marked the beginning of an existential crisis for Shamsa, in which he notes in a statement that he wrote a few years later, which he talks about his coming to England. And I'll move to the next slide. And one more. Shamsa's crisis was artistic as well as personal, because he felt kind of out of place also in London. But precisely, I would argue that due to this sense of dislocation, and because his previous artistic achievements had offered him no way out, the Slade years actually became highly productive for him. Not only did he work intensively on his own work, he was also exposed to a range of global art housed in British museum collections, and he engaged in a sustained study of Islamic art from various regions and periods, which was an opportunity that would have been unavailable to him in Lahore, where even Mughal paintings produced in Lahore many of them are actually not there in the city anymore. Shamsa began to work now based on his own lived and studied knowledge and experience of carpet patterns, Mughal architecture from Lahore, and calligraphic forms. And in a way, he abandons his, what I would call an illustrative approach to modern art, and begins a search for a deeper compositional schema. And this painting, Still Life from 1958, still from its student days, is a kind of a breakthrough for him, because it moves from the volumetric depiction of space in the lower part of the painting to an abstract, flattened and calligraphic rendering, and also defined by geometry in the upper middle of the canvas, and which prefigures his later work. Now, Shamsa was, the exhibitions Shamsa participated in, in the late 50s and early 60s are actually, many of them were done under the rubric of Commonwealth artists who were showing in galleries such as Gallery 1 and also the New Vision Center. This invitation card, this is actually a who's who of artists from actually much of the former British Empire that are now living and working or showing in London. Shamsa continued to investigate the relation between textual and visual practice in his work. He investigated a small number of themes: walls and architecture, electronic circuit boards, the letter meme of the Arabic alphabet, and a few others. For example, in this work, 1 to 9 and 1 to 7, he notes in Urdu, a circle, a square, a puzzle, for which a lifetime is not enough to resolve. These geometric forms would provide him with a set of finite yet flexible building blocks. Much of the work seen in reference to the shapes of these semicircles and is evident in this work, as it is in works such as this work reproduced on the cover of the other story catalog, as well as seen in his sketchbook, where you see him working out calligraphic motifs, which increasingly become more abstract as he does his exercises, as well as in paintings such as Love Letter 1. On the other hand, in Love Letter 1, you have the composition bound by geometric reticulation in passages of varying modulation and frequency. Yet here, using the Roman alphabet, the work strains against its strict geometric forms. On the other hand, Meme 1, which is based on the letter Meme, the letter is written is interpreted in a strict optical geometry of lines and circles. The last major body of work he produces is called the Root series, which he worked on from 1977 until his sudden and untimely death in 1985. These works would often delineate an imagined plant form in the upper half of the picture, while the lower half depicts root forms. And so I'm showing you a sketchbook, and then I'm showing you a work. These are rendered in flat optical shapes on a richly textured hand-dyed cloth, while and are more frequently based on abstracted Arabic cursive scripts, as you can see in the lower half of this work. These works relay the anguish of diaspora in a formally restrained language based on calligraphy and ornamental design inspired by Oriental carpets and textiles. Made on a small format, their movable character recalls works by other artists who have worked with issues of portability of artistic form with reference to exile and diaspora. And the example of Marcel Duchamp during the Second World War comes to mind as well. Moreover, Roots, while retaining a strong sense of the formal discipline in its serial execution, is unabashedly more decorative than much of Shamsa's work. Now, theorists like Adolf Loos had declared that modern man's love for ornament was a sign of his criminality and degeneracy. And there are any number of thematic and formal ways in which modernism strove very hard to distinguish itself simply from being equated with decoration and ornament. It may be noted that Islamic art has been characterized in art historical scholarship precisely as ornamental, decorative, or applied, or functional in the way Gombrich had described in the lecture that had proved so shattering to Shamsa when he heard them during his Slade years. For modern artists, drawing inspiration from Islamic art, however, the relation between modernism and decoration cannot be so easily disavowed. In this sense, the Root series brings the question of ornament and its relation to the development of modernism, and I think sharpens this question, especially with reference to modernism's intimate yet unacknowledged relation to the arts of the non-Western world. Moreover, the roots of the plant form in works such as these are textual and letterist, suggesting that a return to one's roots is no longer based on a kind of a national or organic or blood and soil kind of affiliation, but the roots themselves have now become transnational in their historic and contemporary valences. So to conclude, the experiments in calligraphic abstraction of artists such as Al-Salahi and Shamsa raised questions of legibility, their abstractions emphasizing form over the kind of legibility, transcending national boundaries by its nature. Calligraphy in its dialogue with post-Cubist painting and figuration opened up a textual conversation and a painterly conversation, acknowledging its legacy, but also speaking to transnational modernism in new ways. Both artists re-territorialized the Arabic script, foregrounding its transnational nature while making its aesthetic more permeable to the outside, and so destabilizing simple association between art and place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iftikhar. Thanks for that really thought-provoking paper and for bringing us into the globalizing mid-20th century moment, and gives us much to discuss afterwards. Next up is Ruth Simbao, the NRF DSI Research Chair in Geopolitics and the Arts of Africa at Rhodes University in Makanda, South Africa. She received her PhD from Harvard University and is currently an editor of African Arts. She is core researcher in the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence and the primary investigator of artivism, social justice, and epistemic revolution. Due to rolling blackouts in South Africa, Ruth has kindly filmed her presentation in advance for us so that there will be no interruptions. Such are the lengths our speakers across 6 different time zones have had to navigate. Ruth will be available afterwards, though, for live questions. So thank you, Ruth. Please go ahead and begin.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where in the world you are. Thank you so much for being here and for listening to our conversations. I would like to thank the Smithsonian Institute for inviting me to participate in these really fascinating and timely discussions about African and Asian entanglements. And I would also like to draw your attention to the first image of my PowerPoint that has names of people that I would like to acknowledge and thank for their input in this work. The research I'm going to talk about today is research that I conducted in Lusaka and the Copperbelt in December last year and in January this year. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. So the dominant China-Africa discourse, which largely focuses on politics and power and capital, is in my view quite impoverished without the perspective of creatives. In various publications, I've argued that it is contemporary artists who push past stereotypes, who offer meaningful insight, who register complex resistances, explore audacious solidarities that go beyond facile rhetoric of solidarity, and create intimate geopolitical perspectives with personal stories that read against the grain. On the surface of the broader discourse, there appears to be a split between solidarity and resistance that aligns with the official perspectives of some political and business elites on the one hand, and on the other hand, unofficial perspectives of everyday citizens who desire social justice that is often out of reach. Elites tend to perpetuate the rhetoric of Chinese and African friendship that held currency during African liberation struggles but is now outdated. And citizens resist what is often viewed as Chinese neocolonialism. Below the surface, however, African perspectives of China are usually entangled with local politics and the refusal of elites to meaningfully engage with civil society. In a Zambian context, this contrast between solidarity and resistance is evident in a comparison of the exhibition at the Lusaka National Museum commemorating the building of the Tazara Railway, the poster child of Africa-China friendship, and the street protest by James Lukuku, who opposed Chinese presence in Zambia with his sign, China equals Hitler. It is imperative to ask questions about the ways in which resistance and solidarity are entangled in complex ways, as this holds the potential to texture perceptions, the representations, and the experiences of African and Chinese engagements. In this presentation, I reflect on the notion of soft power, which is often viewed as a tool of the people who have power, and is seldom pried open by consideration of unofficial perspectives, points of resistance, and spaces of slippage or subversion. Soft power is about strategic narratives, and China-Africa's soft power tends to be associated with Chinese state-run media, such as CGTN or Xinhua, or the Rambo-esque soft power of the blockbuster film Wolf Warrior 2. There's a need for research outside of the official that is independent of political parties, beyond the well-rehearsed scripts of blockbusters and headlines. Multiple dynamics intersect, cut across the official and the unofficial, the personal and the political, particularly in the realm of art, which typically strives for more nuance and depth. There's been a burgeoning of soft power cultural exchanges between China and Africa, sometimes accompanied by exhibitions that are often more about the act of exchange or the show of friendship than about artists or art objects themselves. When Zambian sculptor Eddie Mumba was sent by the Minister of Commerce to Hunan to be trained in ceramics alongside artists from Nigeria, Uganda, and Papua New Guinea, he came home with a certificate, but the techniques he learned could not be implemented as the equipment was not available. High-level money was used for the exchange of people, but the exchange of transferable ideas did not meet the needs of local art contexts. In January this year, I visited the Temple Fair of the Chinese Spring Festival in Lusaka, which featured the China-Zambia cultural and art exchange. The event included dances of the dragon and lion, and Chinese and Zambian officials joined together to dot the eyes of a Chinese dragon with ink. During one of the singing performances, animated video footage referenced the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and included classical Chinese soft power images of very choreographed cultural diversity that directly recalls Chinese posters of quote-unquote Third World Brotherhood in the 1960s and 1970s. Extending the metaphor of friendship further, between China and Africa, an artist exchange was enacted and displayed on stage. 4 Chinese artists, all from Jilin, and 2 Zambian artists, performed African-Chinese interaction by showcasing their respective techniques before an audience of officials and Chinese people based in Lusaka. Virtually no Zambians were present. Mr. Yao, a Lusaka-based businessman and president of the Zambia Jilin Overseas Association, opened his Sino-Zambia Art Salon with an inaugural exhibition organized in collaboration with Zambian artist Patrick Mumba. And the smaller event, which included speeches, a fundraiser auction, and a showcase of Chinese painting techniques, allowed artists to engage in a more meaningful way. Despite Zambia being upheld as the ultimate picture of Africa-China camaraderie due to the building of the Tazara, there's a struggle on both sides to translate historical political friendship into meaningful contemporary engagement. There's a regurgitation of old stories created at the time of Bandung and quote-unquote third world anti-imperialism, when a very different China existed and which even then glossed over certain differences. If these stagnant narratives are merely recycled, how effective are they really? How valuable are they in terms of soft power? Soft power that is predominantly conversation between officials is limited. And when there's an attempt to ignite the interest of the youth, they often seem to fall flat. When Confucius Institute at the University of Zambia collaborated with art students at the Evelyn Hone College in Lusaka, students were enticed to participate with the offer of art materials. Evelyn Hone lecturer, Andrew Katambula, explained that the topics of paintings were prescribed by books and images that were presented to the students by the Confucius Institute. In an interview, Katambula said that the topics were based on propaganda, his word, and the students' creativity was constrained. He added that students were coerced, again, his word, into participating with the hope of possibly selling their paintings or even being offered a scholarship to study in China. Joseph Nye, who coined the term soft power, views coercion as hard power and persuasion and attraction as soft power. Of course, the difference between coercion and persuasion is far from clear-cut, particularly in the arts that value unfixed interpretation. Most of the paintings portrayed Zambian and Chinese flags, the Great Wall of China, or the building of the Tazara. Sinzumwa's work portrays a Chinese man in a white shirt who appears to be a foreman and stands in front of the Zambian workers, whereas in Shianda's and Mulenga's works, Chinese workers labor alongside Zambians. Despite the general uniformity of the paintings, these subtle differences begin to touch on a debate about the contrast between Chinese presence in Africa and the presence of white colonialists and Western neoliberal capitalists who didn't and generally don't work and labor alongside Zambians. In December last year, I visited the building site of the Tazara Memorial Park in Chongwe District, Lusaka Province. The aim of this memorial is to commemorate the over 60 Chinese people who died during the building of the Tazara Railway. And the bodies in Zambia will be moved from Leopard's Hill Cemetery and a gravesite in Mpika, which is about 150 kilometers north of Lusaka. Mark Chang, who is overseeing the construction, showed us the building site and the nursery where specific plants and trees are being grown for this eco-park. The overall design of the park reflects the Chinese knot, representing the friendship between China and Africa, and I quote, the intertwined hand-to-hand and heart-to-heart friendship, unquote. In the middle of the park is a sculpture that apparently is being made in China and not by local artists in Zambia, represents the iron soul of the workers. And behind this, there's a monument with the text, the Chinese martyrs who helped Africa are immortal. Besides my research on Chinese presence in Zambia, my interest was further piqued by the fact that the land used for the park is in the chiefdom of Her Royal Highness Senior Chieftainess and Commercial Mokamamba II, who I've previously written about. When I returned to some Chongwe villages last year, the common story that I heard was one of dissent. On one level, it was the typical stories of resistance that were very common in some of Zambia's media and on the ground, such as the Chinese are taking over, the Chinese are taking our land, the Chinese wouldn't let Africans build such a large memorial in China. Below the surface, however, was a frustration and a mourning of the lack of solidarity in terms of the Zambian government. Clearly, the anti-Chinese rhetoric that exists in this area is entangled in domestic politics. A few days before my visit, about 200 headmen from Chongwe district protested against the ruling party, the Patriotic Front. The PF was founded by Michael Sutter, who infamously used stark anti-Chinese rhetoric in his election campaign in 2011. And Sutter's nephew, Miles Sampa, who is currently the mayor of Lusaka, although temporarily suspended, has also been involved in controversies with Chinese business owners. The protests in Chongwe against the ruling party grew out of the fact that the PF cadres had invaded the Soli Chakwela Makombi ceremony in October last year, harassing guests, disrespecting traditional leaders, and looting food. When they were asked to apologize, they refused to comply, causing great distress for the Soli chieftain. When I spoke with people in Chisiko village, they expressed frustration that the ruling party had negotiated the use of land for the memorial park without any communication with the traditional leader in the area. Apparently, it was the Chinese who insisted on a courtesy call to Her Royal Highness to obtain her express permission to use the land, and this letter from the Busoli royal establishment is posted at the construction site. Residents in Chongwe asked, why is the memorial not in Iftikhar, where the train line runs and some of the bodies are already buried? And why don't the Chinese also commemorate the Zambians who died when building the Tazara? Certainly, these are pertinent questions that touch on the very heart of friendship and solidarity that needs to be shifted into the contemporary. In an attempt to piece together a different side of the story, I'm currently collaborating with Lusaka-based artist Dari Mwabe to conduct further research on Zambians who died during the building of the railway. And the railway, the attempt is to move towards a more reciprocal notion of solidarity. Stari Mwaba was born in 1976, the same year as the official opening of the Tazara Railway in New Kapiri Mposhi, and he recently received his master's degree at Rose University with his exhibition titled Black Mountain. When he exhibited in Germany in 2015, he was struck by the fact that Europeans tended to reduce his work just to a story about Chinese economic colonization. Even though this perspective aligns with some general public opinion in Zambia, Mwabe felt convinced that this was not the full story, and that on the ground, realities were far more complex. Engaging with the history of the Tazara and contemporary presence of the Chinese in the copperbelt mining industry, Stari Mwabe focuses on the way stories are created in the media, official and social, as well as in everyday conversations. His work is informed by his personal story of growing up on the copperbelt, as well as the story of his relatives. His grandfather's father, his great-uncles, worked formerly in the mines, and later his cousin worked informally in the mines. His daughter attended a Chinese school, and his grandmother lived along the railway line. Stari's grandmother spoke fondly of the Tazara railway line. Her perspective was less of a romanticized solidarity between Zambia and China than a story of local solidarity, reflecting the dedication of communities living close to the line to protect it from the sabotage of white supremacist governments of South Africa and Rhodesia. Conducting research for his master's, Mwabe traveled the train routes of his childhood, speaking with fellow travelers and taking photographs. He projected some of the photographs onto large sheets of newspaper that he painstakingly perforated by burning particular words with a soldering iron. He describes his process as follows. I would join different stories together, selecting things, cancelling words out, treating text as a sculptural object. Some of the stories were specifically about mining, you'd be amazed how many times the words China, China appeared in the news. The newspaper is very physical, and having these holes allowed me to contribute to the story. Conversations with Starry reveal his sensitivity to the complexities of storytelling about Chinese presence in Zambia. On social media, Zambians commonly express the opinion that sovereignty of their country is at stake, as is reflected in the social media name Zambia, which suggests that China is taking over Zambia. In his series, Creating a Nation Out of Newsprint, Zambia, the New Colony, Mwabe utilizes his technique of burnt and perforated newspapers to allude to the possibility and indeed the necessity of counter-narratives. In October 2018, there was an outcry in Zambia about a story that was printed in Mandarin in the government-run newspaper, The Times of Zambia. The English version featured on the front page and was titled, "We've Still Got It. Lungu, the president, says he's not bothered by East-West talk, but doing what is good for Zambia." And a smaller version of the story was published on a different page in Mandarin. Zambians were outraged, declaring that the Chinese had bought the newspaper and questioned if Mandarin were now an official language of Zambia. The government's defense that the cash-strapped newspaper was merely seeking advertising revenue from the Chinese community was dismissed by the Zambian public. And as far as I know, no other Times article was published in Mandarin. One of the problems, says Mwabe, is that people hold high regard for international platforms, such as BBC and CNN. But, he says, there's a gap between the truth and what the international platforms say. For example, after listening to a documentary about river pollution on the Copper Belt, Starry assumed that it was specifically the Chinese who were polluting the river. But after digging deeper himself, he realized that the UK Indian-owned Konkolo copper mine contributed to the pollution, and that environmental damage is linked to Western mining companies and systems still in place from the colonial era. Questions about the loss of Zambian sovereignty arose yet again with the news that not only were the Chinese buying Zambian newspapers and Zambian TV stations, but they'd also bought the Black Mountain on the Copper Belts. To people outside of Zambia who might not know what the Black Mountain is, the suggestion that China was buying a mountain in Zambia sounded alarming indeed. The Black Mountain is a mining slag, a dump site of smelted rock that has been rejected after most of the valuable minerals have already been extracted. It existed in Kitwe when Mwabe was a young child, and we visited it together last year. When Starry was young, the mountain was barely fenced, and he and his friends would sneak into the area that they called Mu Danger because of the signs, danger, danger, even though they didn't really hear of people being hurt back then. At that stage, Zambians didn't attempt to remine what trace of minerals might be left in the slag, as the sale of copper was controlled by the government and no sideline market existed. Since then, the mines were privatized, and Zambians lost much of their mineral wealth to mining companies from the US, the UK, Canada, and Switzerland. And these companies actually lowered the working conditions of Zambian miners. More recently, with the lack of Zambian regulation, Chinese middlemen have created a market for small-scale sales, and individuals, mostly Zambians, have started to remine slag, such as the Black Mountain in Wusakile in Kitwe. The unstable mountain is extremely dangerous, especially when it's been remined manually. And in his research, Mwabe collected stories from small-scale miners who would point out spots where fellow miners were buried by the mountain and died. His work, titled Mapping Black Mountain Land 1, is based on a geology and mineral deposits map, and the small crosses on the original map take on new meaning as they allude in the artwork to the places where miners died. The repeated grey squares that you see around the edges are made by rubbing over plastic frames of slides, referencing an outdated method of documenting and archiving. As such, Mwabe builds archival layers of meaning that allow contemporary, unofficially recorded realities, such as the deaths of artisanal miners, to reinterpret the layers of past imposed realities, such as colonial and capitalist control of the mines. At times, the manual remining of the Black Mountain in Kitwe was illegal, and at other times it was allowed. When the Chinese middlemen created this new market, young men, including Stari's cousin, realized that they could suddenly make a lot of money without formal training. They quickly learned how to recognize which minerals still existed in which pieces of rock and would fill up sacks and sell them. When a Chinese company expressed interest in buying the whole Black Mountain in Usakile, the Zambian youth went to court and were granted a particular period of time to legally remine the dump before it would officially be handed over to the new buyer. A further layer to these narratives, says Mwabe, is the corruption of the Zambian government. As with the story about the Tazara Memorial and the Busoni chiefdom, Zambian politics is at play. According to Mwabe, from what he could make of the unofficial stories on the ground, some members of parliament would organize groups of young people to mine for them, despite the danger, in the name of the youth. They would bring in youth who were loyal to their political party, and if other youth went in, they would be beaten up. It became very political, says Mwabe, because it was so profitable. When Starry and I were there in December, mining activity was relatively quiet as the Chinese company fenced it off and posted police around the mountain. It is important for Chinese companies to prevent all accidents and deaths, following a fatal explosion in a Chinese-owned dynamite factory in 2005 that caused a lot of controversy. Although significant improvements have been made in Chinese-owned companies on the copper belt, as Yen Harong and Barry Saltman point out through meticulous analysis, the stereotype of the cruel Chinese is perpetuated, pointing to serious methodological flaws in none other than a report by the Human Rights Watch. They argue that the West fuels racial discrimination against the Chinese, whereas white-owned companies with worse track records are let off the hook. Zambian youths who previously mined there seem determined to go back, and in some areas, corrupt police can be paid to gain entrance. This is money, miners told Mwabe, pointing to the mountain. This is where we bought our cars. We would die for this. This is our thing. We will get shot for this. We will mine with them, referring to the Chinese. Extending his work that is created out of news stories, Mwabe explores the issues of mining from the perspective of informal miners, the people on the ground who risk their lives to make a living. My Kalange's superhero references a local story about a young man who was boiled at birth and now cannot be harmed by heat or fire. There is a powerful parallel between Mwabe's layering of official stories, unofficial stories, narratives and counter-narratives about Chinese presence in Zambia, and the conceptual layering in his artwork, and the material layering as well. I read his use of materiality as an intimate engagement with the site of Black Mountain itself. A close-up view of the mountainous structure reveals textures and holes that evoke smelting, burning, dripping, as well as cooling, solidifying, that leaves gaps, literal holes in the facade of solidity. This parallels the burning and soldering of the newspapers, which breaks down the apparent solidity of stories and reveals gaps in the knowledge that were already there. Mwabe's artwork deeply textures the perceptions, the representations, and the experiences of African and Chinese engagements in ways that resist superfluous associations of art and culture with soft power. Far from perpetuating smooth stories of official friendship between political and business elites, he engages directly with everyday Zambians on the ground, trying to understand how they actually engage with Chinese middlemen, despite, as Harong and Saltman demonstrated, the flagrantly inaccurate perceptions that the West and white capital create. But with artist's eyes, he complicates the notion of resistance, where it lies, how it plays out, as facile protest that rides on easy headlines is barely resistance at all. Instead, such practice-based research inches step by step towards the potential for reciprocal solidarity that moves far beyond the shallow stories of friendship or animosity between China and Zambia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. That was absolutely fascinating. And now for a response to today's 3 excellent papers, I'd like to welcome Finbarr Barry Flood, who is founder-director of CISLA, Center for Material Histories, and the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of the Humanities at the Institute of Fine Arts and Department of Art History, New York University. His publications include The Great Mosque of Damascus, Studies on the Makings of an Umayyad Visual Culture, and Objects of Translation, Material Culture and Medieval Hindu-Muslim Encounter, a book that, if I may, has been absolutely transformative for my own ways of thinking about objects and the world, as it continues to be for many scholars. So welcome, Barry. Please begin.
Good morning, everybody. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to respond to these 3 very interesting papers and to be among old friends and new colleagues, even virtually, as we all are this morning. The papers each focused on a different aspect of artistic exchanges between Asia and Africa. Whether these are framed in terms of connection or comparison, they cover a wide geography and a chronological range extending over a millennium. So it's a kind of tough job to have to respond. Inevitably, therefore, my comments can only skim the surface of some of the issues raised, but they will attempt to do so from the perspective of 2 among the many issues that the papers raise, which seem to me especially illuminating and perhaps relevant to the conference as a whole. So let me keep you in suspense while I see if I can share my screen with you here. Okay, so those 2 issues that I'd like to think about this morning are, first, the issue that comes to mind is that seen collectively, the papers remind us of the need to take a longue durée perspective, to think about the long term, to think about the long term, and to, when we consider African-Asian links, to remember that these are nothing new, that we need to think about these as exchanges that have happened over certainly more than a millennium, as the papers from the symposium have shown us, but also at the same time, the need to pay attention to the shifting nature of these connections through time, not to think of them as timeless. Sea routes change, hegemonic centers rise and fall, emporia wax and wane in importance. The second imperative, I would suggest, is to consider questions of mediation that have always been central to such contexts. Now, mediation can take different forms. It can take the form of persons, merchants and mariners, for example, but it can also take the form of material things, the Indian textiles that Ruth Barnes showed us, that were used as sources for the artists who painted the interior of a Yemeni madrasa, or the images and publications through which the modern artists discussed by Iftikhar access some of the rich repertoire of historical Islamic inscriptions, calligraphy, and scripts that were so central to their practice. So those are the 2 points that the response will make. First of all, the question of the need for a longue durée perspective, the advantages and disadvantages, and the second, the question of mediation. In the case of the world that Ruth Barnes opens to us, mediation and mobility are inextricably linked, most obviously in the maritime technologies that enabled movement between the continents. The magnificent image of the ship that Ruth showed us is particularly relevant to the theme of the symposium as a whole. Although painted in Baghdad in 1237 of the Common Era, it harks back, in fact, to a much earlier world of Indian Ocean commerce and travel in the 9th and 10th centuries, during the heyday of the Abbasid Caliphate. It reminds us of 2 important points. First, that this was a cosmopolitan, or at least probably a better word is heterogeneous world, exemplified in this painting by the care taken to delineate the differences in color and dress between the Indian captain, the African sailors, and the passengers so comfortably seated inside the boat, who from their dress are likely Arab or Persian. The painting, I think, also reminds us, it's been used as a kind of celebratory evocation of a world of cosmopolitan commerce, but it also reminds us that this was a hierarchical world, and of the physical labor, pain, slavery, and suffering often needed to sustain such connections, emblematized in this painting perhaps by the two small figures seen at the bottom of the boat who are bailing water from its interior and who look considerably less comfortable than the passengers looking out the window above. Such an image reminds us of the many contributions that Africans and Indians made to the pre-colonial or medieval Indian Ocean trade. Other kinds of evidence remind us of the various roles that both Africans and Asians, especially Indians, played in connecting Africa and Asia. For example, a letter written, and Ruth has touched on these kinds of letters in her paper, a letter written to the Jewish merchant, Abraham bin Yuju, who resided in Mangalore on the coast of southern India in the 1130s, mentions an Ethiopian captain or pilot, a Ruban, who was the pilot or captain of a ship trading between Aden and South India, and who, with the name of Masood, was evidently an Ethiopian Muslim. And again, the point is to remember that we have African participants in this trade in a variety of contexts. Evidence for the involvement of Ethiopian Christians, as well as Muslims, in the Indian Ocean trade at the same time, that's the 12th, 13th century, is no less lacking. Such connections presumably explain the popularity of the kinds of Indian textiles that Ruth discusses in East Africa, especially in Ethiopia, where they can be documented as imported in large quantities from at least the 14th century and probably earlier. On the southern coast of Yemen, recent archaeological finds have brought to light ceramic evidence that suggests the existence of medieval African diaspora communities in southern Yemen on the coast of the Hadramaut of Yemen. While a wonderful cast bronze statuette of a lion excavated by the archaeologist Mark Horton at Shanga on the coast of Kenya resembles similar statuettes produced in South India at this time, but may have been produced in East Africa for an Indian diasporic community. Analysis of the metal of the statuette suggested that much of it came from Chinese coins, which were favored around the Indian Ocean littoral for their metal content. Now, there's little evidence for direct African-Chinese contacts at this stage. So once again, we are dealing with mediated contacts involving both persons and things. Sometimes it's difficult to know which we're dealing with, whether we're looking at the material traces of things in motion, mobile human agents, or both. The door from the Ashrafia Mosque in Taiz in Yemen that Ruth Barnes showed us certainly has strong affinities with the stone and wood carving of Gujarat in Western India. But whether it was imported pre-carved or carved in Yemen by craftsmen trained in Gujarat, from Gujarat, or trained in a Gujarati style is not clear. It is, however, worth pointing out that there seems to have been a trans-historical tradition of Indian woodworkers working in Yemen and East Africa that endured well into the 20th century. Harar in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa is especially rich in examples of such doors carved by Indian artisans who often signed their work and who worked in Indic or Indian styles. The example I show you here on the screen is from the house of Ras Makonnen, the governor of Harar and the father of the future Ethiopian emperor Haile Selassie. Now, are these kinds of artifacts African or Asian? Is the question even worth posing? Is it not the case that even the most translocal of forms, styles, and tastes are always inflected or inhabited by the specificity of place, to use a phrase from Iftikhar Dadi's paper? In many ways, the work of the artist that Iftikhar discusses exemplifies the dialectic between trans-regional artistic trends, abstraction, modernism, and so forth, and regional and often highly personalized expressions of those trends, perhaps emblematized by the calligraphy of roots in some of Shemsa's works that Iftikhar showed us. In the case of Ibrahim as-Salahi, his endeavor to bring out the figural aspects of calligraphy was common to a range of modernists working in the Islamic world, from North Africa to South Asia, even if the particular forms of the figural in El-Salahi's work refer to the African cultures with which he was most familiar. As Iftikhar notes, there is likely also an ironic or playful, a deconstructionist almost engagement with the Orientalist idea of Islamic art as a decorative art in a pejorative sense, most notably in the form of the so-called arabesque, that most transregional and intercultural of ornaments, whose formal values fascinated so many modernists, even as other modernists saw the arabesque as an index of meaningless frivolity. However, I also wonder, looking at especially some of the works of Ibrahim al-Salahi, whether an important element of this transregional experiment with the possibilities of calligraphic form was not already inherent in the history of Islamic calligraphy itself, in the ideas of the Arabic alphabet, associated with certain kinds of mystical or occultist thinking, in which the essence of things was contained in the potency and potentiality of certain letters of the Arabic alphabet. The destabilization of the boundaries between figure and script is also evident in examples of Islamic calligrams, figures comprised of Arabic script, Arabic or Persian, Ottoman sometimes, that in contrast to the figurative forms that al-Salahi found concealed in Arabic letters in each letter of the alphabet, here they reveal themselves, the figures reveal themselves only when the work is apprehended or read as a totality. So the script is working in a slightly different way here, but I think there are interesting, maybe historical precedents and analogies to think about. The important point, I think, is that the kinds of modernism discussed in Iftikhar's paper are marked not only by their transregional or translocal, but also by their transtemporal qualities, qualities of reaching back for the materials of modernism, even across a chasm of disjunction and rupture associated with colonialism. In their expressions of artistic visions that directly engage some of the artistic legacies of the Islamic past, in the search for a modernism appropriate to the global South in an era of decolonization, the spirit of the work of Ibrahim al-Salahi and Anwar Jalal Shemsa captures something of the intoxicating possibilities for a decolonized future raised by the 1955 Bandung Conference, which is perhaps the example of Afro-Asian collaboration. Given where we are in the United States at this very moment, it is perhaps not inappropriate to remind ourselves of some of the tenets of the declaration that emerged from the 1955 Bandung Conference, and I read only three. 1, respect for fundamental human rights and the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. 2, respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations. 3, recognition of the equality of all races and of the equality of all nations, large and small. So these are three of the central tenets that came out of the Bandung meeting. Stepping back to the past few days and our wonderful symposium, one slight concern perhaps with the symposium as a whole is that because the Indian Ocean has been so central to many of the kinds of connections and contacts between Africa and Asia that have been addressed in the conference, the examples chosen have tended to skew in favor of the eastern half of the African continent, leaving the possibility of Asian-African connections and their material traces in West or Central Africa less explored. In this respect, Ruth Simbao's paper offers a very welcome contribution for addressing the Zambian context of a contemporary phenomenon that is palpable across the continent, from Ghana to Addis and beyond. If most pre-modern and early modern connections between China and Africa were mediated, current China-African connections represent a very new phenomenon of direct engagement that to some extent builds on the legacy of the spirit of cooperation that was forged at the Bandung Conference, or at least on its rhetoric. The impact of recent Chinese involvement in Africa on economy, infrastructure, and politics has often been negatively perceived, not least by Euro-American entities with their own ambitions in the region, as we heard. Partly also because it takes place against the background of less visible and less celebratory modes of contemporary intercultural engagement, such as the treatment of the Muslim Uyghur population in Xinjiang. However, we should also bear in mind that the use of soft power in Africa is not confined to American or Chinese actors. I show you here a 16th or 17th century style Ottoman mosque recently built in Accra, Ghana, which is the largest mosque in West Africa and was a gift from the Republic of Turkey. And again, I don't have to underline the intersections between soft power and economic connections that's implicit in the image. Evaluations of Chinese involvement in Africa generally happen at the macro level, rarely considering the complexities of perception and reception on the ground. Ruth Simbao's paper reminds us once again of the need to think both of the big picture and the local story together, to move beyond generalities about a monolithic phenomenon sometimes lazily described as Chinese influence, and to consider how these developments play out in the lives of those situated in particular places. More specifically, Ruth considers artistic responses on the part of Zambian artists, especially the artist Stari Mwamba, to these developments, drawing out some of the ambivalences and ambiguities that adumbrate a much more complex picture than the rhetoric of governing elites or the representatives of the Belt and Road Initiative would have us see. Once again, she reminds us of the need to think not only in terms of the abstractions of trans-regional connections or their trans-temporal qualities, but the fact that each and every one of the examples that we've discussed in this symposium has its own rooted or situated context and history, even if these often remain invisible or inaccessible to us, less visible, for example, than the modernist artists discussed by Iftikhar, who have left more archival traces. And I would say that even this is not straightforward because the amount of labor involved in tracking down those archival traces is far from minimal. But they've left more archival traces, for example, than the traces of the Arabian and African consumers and Indian producers of Ruth's textiles. A crucial final point to note, I think, is that like many of the papers that we've heard over the past days, all three stories told by our presenters this morning can be told without reference to Europe, except perhaps as a space of imperial cosmopolitanism, where African and South Asian modernists encounter narratives of cultural hierarchies or marginalization that inspire resistance. We heard some of the stories of the reception of Islamic art history by the artist that Iftikhar described. That aside, these are stories of contact across continents to which Europe and its histories are irrelevant. Histories of contacts that long precede the era of European colonialism and attempted dominion over the spaces of connectivity that we've heard about over the past few days. To understand this requires a longue durée perspective. Such histories always run the risk of flattening, of obscuring the particularities to which all three papers alert us. But they have the dual advantage, that's these longue durée histories, have the dual advantage of moving us beyond Euro-centered histories of the region, and at the same time of highlighting shifting patterns of connection through time, of historicizing those connections. In an article on globalism and globalization that was published in 2002, the political scientist Joseph Nye, who Ruth Simbao also cited, argued that, quote, globalism is a phenomenon with ancient roots. Thus, the issue is not how old globalism is, but rather how thin or thick it is at any given time, end quote. In this sense, Nye's comments bring us back to the starting point of this entire symposium, to Elizabeth Lambourne's paper that began the conference by outlining the pulses, as she put it, the waxes and wanings of Afro-Asian exchange over more than a millennium. Thank you.
Thank you. That was spectacular, summing us up. And I'd like to invite all of our speakers to come back on the screen. And we'll open it up to questions from the audience just momentarily, but I wanted to give all our speakers a chance to either respond to anything that Barry raised or ask each other any questions that you have for each other. If you'd like to speak, just please unmute yourself and go right ahead.
Ruth, you're currently muted.
I just wanted to respond, if I may, to something that Finbarr Barry mentioned. And I think your comment when you had the image of, I think it was a Turkish Airlines, I think this is a critically important point, because one of the issues with the broader discourse, this is outside of the visual arts, the broader discourse of China, Africa, is often it gets so stuck in what's going on between the US and China at the moment, particularly with Donald Trump. And I know, Sari talks about the Turkish embassy becoming more and more important in Zambia, and so many of the other embassies are actually shutting down, and so many embassies who supported the visual arts in Zambia financially are leaving and moving, and the other embassies, such as the Turkish embassy, are starting to play a more important role. So I agree. I think that's a really important point. Thank you for that.
Could I just add, sorry, I started talking while I was still unmuted. I just really want to thank Barry for bringing a historical perspective to the three talks we had this morning. I think that is a very important point to bear in mind, that we really need to look at these issues not just as the particular that are inevitable part of our presentations, short presentations, but to look beyond what we see as our own specialization or focus of interest. It was really wonderful to hear your comments, Barry, and to hear you draw all of this material so effortlessly together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. If I can just add to pick up on a point in your paper, which is the question of the need to historicize these kind of connections rather than situate them somehow outside of time. And one thing that your paper drew attention to was the rise of the Karimi merchants who dominate the Red Sea trade from the 13th, 14th century onwards. This is a major, although it's hardly ever said, this is a major kind of rerouting of the Indian Ocean trade networks away from the Gulf towards the Red Sea. It happens with the decline of the Abbasids, the rise of the Fatimids, and yet we don't really think about that. For example, the painting I showed, it's often taken as an index of Indian-Iraqi connections in the 13th century, but by then the main trade route had shifted completely away from the Gulf. And so what you're getting is kind of echo of a much earlier tradition, the kind of connections of the 9th, 10th century that were so well displayed in the Fear Sackler Gallery's exhibition on Abbasid ceramics, blue and white ceramics, several years ago. So there's a very particular case of where thinking about just Indian Ocean trade actually masks major shifts that have to do with the geopolitics of the region, every bit as much as the geopolitics of the contemporary world.
Yeah. Barry, thank you very much for your really insightful comments. Yeah, I think you pointed out the suggestion that calligraphy itself has these kind of a mystical and a kind of a worldview, or a kind of a Sufi worldview also that emerges from this practice, and that it traffics with the various kinds of, first of all, different calligraphic styles that are also used in different regions, but also how it sometimes is not just a legible script, but it also is a token, a cipher, a symbol, metaphor, even before we come to the modern age. And I think all those meanings would be important to think about the practice, the practices of artists like like Al-Salahi, and I've done some of this work in relation to Sadr Khan, whom I wrote about in another place. The other thing I think you pointed out very nicely was the notion of this kind of a playful, and the kind of the playful character of modernist practice, which I would also emphasize, the nature of experimentation and play and practice. So when we looked at the statement by Al-Salahi, he said, let's forget about the ivory tower and get to work, right? So I think the notion of working through practice, but finding a way forward through kind of experimentation, play and practice is a very important aspect of we think of these paintings as finished works, but we don't, I think it's also important to emphasize that these are gambits at one level, right? These are experiments, these are projects that people do, and and there is a notion of tentativeness and hesitancy and processual nature in the very process of the practice of modernism that I would like to emphasize here.
Of course, the problem with that is moving away from the ivory tower and towards putting the emphasis on practice sidelines the art historian, but that's a whole other problem. One quick question, I don't want to, but do we have evidence for his interest in letterism, in the Hurufi tradition of mystical letter, occultism associated with letters? I've seen some of his works seem to draw on amuletic traditions, for example.
Mm-hmm. So he was well read in, let's say, Sufism. So Salah is actually, he's still alive. He's 90 years old now. He lives in England. And he was extremely, he's not just, a practitioner, but also kind of an intellectual in his own right. So he would have been very familiar with both the kind of the amulets and even West African iconography, which would have been known by then, of course, even in, because of, this is early 20th century developments, but also the kind of the associations of calligraphy, the kind of myriad associations of calligraphy in relation to both stylistic developments, but also it's kind of Sufi and other transcendental kind of associations. So, yeah.
Great. We have a question, actually several questions from the audience that address all of your works in individual ways about the beauty of dancing between disciplines or between regionalisms or media. And so as we work to rewrite these narratives and shape new histories, a question is how comfortable are scholars and curators now in working across media and working across material boundaries in order to make arguments now that we're breaking free from nation-state regionalisms.
May I answer that? I think it is absolutely essential that we are comfortable with working with moving across media. It is it makes our exhibitions and our dealing with objects much more creative when we realize that metalwork can speak to stone, and stone may reflect aspects of textile working. That in my own experience in creating exhibitions, I've always found that the museum fatigue that can set in if you look at, say, at 200 embroideries gets lifted into quite an exhilarating moment of recognition when you see the same patterns appear that you see in the embroideries appear in exquisite metalwork. The mind makes connections that are very, very, you don't even have to put that into words. It is a visual recognition that the visitor will really appreciate. That's speaking from my experience as a curator. And personally, I want to address the question of moving between disciplines. I started out my research in Southeast Asia, and the field of Southeast Asian studies has been transformed by a collaboration between different disciplines over the last, I would say, 30, 35 years. Before then, it was much more likely that people would move between, that linguists would talk to linguists, archaeologists to archaeologists. But when you really start bringing in fields that are foreign to you, one gets a completely new view and completely gains knowledge that is really very, very rewarding. And in our field in Southeast Asian studies, or in the field of Indian Ocean studies, we can only gain and benefit by not being afraid of keeping the boundaries, but move across them. It's daunting because it makes you feel, as a scholar, it makes you feel quite often as a terrible dilettante, but it's worth the risk.
Thank you. We have a question for Ruth Simbao, which I'll just read out if that's all right. Do you think the works of Starry Mwaba help viewers articulate a trajectory of futurity that moves away from hegemonies derived from material scarcity, effective deprivation, and political malfeasance?
Thank you for that question. I think that was Joan, thank you. I guess, in a sense, you're asking a yes/no question, so I could answer yes from my personal perspective, but I think it really depends who the viewer is, and I think no, obviously I wouldn't want to answer that in a yes/no, and I'm not sure entirely what you mean by linking Starry Mwaba's work. Well, I don't know if you are linking Starry Mwaba's work specifically to issues of material scarcity, so I'm not entirely sure what you are asking in relation to his work. But yeah, I think one of the important things that I was trying to talk about today is the importance of really understanding artists and artworks in sort of quite individual and nuanced ways. So if it moves something into futurity, it's quite hard to give an explicit answer about that. In my personal opinion, I would say yes, in the sense that, particularly the way he reads news about Chinese presence in Zambia, the way he engages with newspapers and stories and storytelling in Zambia about the Chinese presence, which I think is extremely problematic and becoming more and more so every day, particularly with the presence of social media. So I'm not sure if I'm quite answering your question, because I'm not sure exactly what you were getting at, but yeah, I'll maybe leave it at that. If anyone else wants to add something, I'd be happy for you to do that.
Okay, we have a question for Iftikhar. You noted the long transnational history of modernism and the permeability of the abstraction that El Salahi and Shamsa consciously developed in London. Given their generational location in the immediate post-colonial period, how do you think their practices help us understand the tensions in nationalism and modernism, and how their practices were or were not intelligible in the space of the national?
Yes, so usually, so part of my work has been to think about, the way when I sort of entered art history and started looking at kind of modern art. And at that time, basically the histories of modern art that were on, being written on non-Western regions were national histories. Okay, so the idea was that you move from decolonization, you move into kind of the nation state. Okay, in much of Asia and Africa. And the developments that take place are kind of national, right? I mean, that was me, along with many other, some other art historians have been saying that that is one facet, that's an important facet of the, developments that take place, but one cannot then forget, first of all, the fact that there were these longer, the way, let's say, the Arabic script was used over a millennium, okay, in many parts of Asia and Africa, and leaves and continues to leave a kind of a legacy, right? Then you also had the presence of colonialism that created common structures, right? For example, if you look at, let's say, the legal system in Nigeria and India, there'll be many common features, right? So colonialism, British colonialism and French colonialism also create kind of, in a sense, commonalities in the experience through which the colonized people encounter colonialism, right? And one of those problems is the problem of the past or the tradition in relation to one's, to the present condition that an artist faces and what to do in future. So I think these are both national problems, but I would argue that through this kind of work is that there are also problems that are bigger than simply being Nigerian or simply being Indian, okay? That these are also, they're also, decolonization is also about this larger issue of grappling with these predicaments, okay? And many of them actually have a shared, there's a kind of a shared past, right? As well as a kind of an aspirational future towards which many of these artists are. So that's at the kind of ideational and intellectual level, aspirational level. But in practice, of course, they're also coming to London or Paris to either study or to, or to exhibit, right? And they're also encountering each other in those spaces. So there's also the trajectories that the artist follows, that most of the artists, the artists that we claim as the great national artists, actually many of them studied abroad or lived abroad for quite a period of time, or encountered kind of, let's say, modernism through publications and, and so on. So, so those are also important aspects to thinking about their experiences as being, and their formation as being thought in a better way as bigger than kind of the box of the nation state.
I think we're wondering also about artists who intentionally chose to bypass Europe and work within transnational Islamic worlds as well.
Yeah, so that would depend on the moment you look at, right? So as Barry also stressed that that these things change over time. So there's another question which said, Stuart Hall's idea about the advanced artistic centers, right? So this was the perception in the mid 20th century. If you were an artist who was trying to develop your career from, from Africa or the Caribbean or South Asia, many people looked at London and Paris as the place to go to, because they, it is the case that these were centers which had more dense practices. And, so in the sense that, Stuart Hall, when he says advanced artistic centers, is also referring to that aspiration that these artists had, and they talk about it in their, in their writings. So in the sense that I wouldn't be too romantic in the mid 20th century about pure south to south exchanges, okay, because you just have the withdrawal of formal colonialism happening at that time, right? And colonialism has profoundly reshaped, this whole region. So I think one can't, I think even the Bandung moment, I would argue, the art that emerges from the Bandung moment is not very interesting, in my opinion, right? I mean, in the sense that the Bandung movement is an important political movement, okay, but you actually don't see a direct one-to-one relationship between Bandung and the art produced from Bandung. What you see rather is a shared sensibility. I would say transnational modernism of Asia and Africa is the Bandung, is expresses of Bandung, provided you don't read it literally, okay?
Thank you. We have one more question for Ruth Simbao. The question is if you've also encountered Chinese artists resident in Zambia that are producing work outside official venues or institutions. The works that you showed were sponsored by the Chinese state. Are there Chinese Zambia or exchanges, art exchanges and collaborations which are off the official stage or state-sponsored or promoted initiatives?
Thank you for that question. I think that was Derek. I think you point to a sort of trajectory that my paper showed, moving towards a more kind of independent artist. But I think obviously one of the important points I was trying to make was the complexity and even the questions around what official and unofficial actually is and what it means. So you talk about official institutions or official venues, I'm assuming in an art context. So the examples of the smaller exhibition that was part of the Spring Festival that was organized by Mr. Yao. So Mr. Yao is a business person who's based in Osaka, and I didn't feel it was appropriate to ask them quite explicitly, who funded you, where did you get your funding from, to what degree is it state funded. So I think even when it comes to state funding, it's not very clear. And I think, I do have questions about the Spring Festival where there are images of the Belt and Road Initiative that are behind the singing performance. And, it raises questions for me about, to what degree there obviously is the link to funding. And I think, so with Mr. Yao, in some ways he is an independent person and not necessarily sort of clearly state-sponsored. But I think in terms of artists who function very independently, like someone like Starry Mwamba, in Zambia specifically, I don't know of Chinese artists who are functioning like that in Zambia. And I think in an African context, what's really important to consider is the different historical waves of Chinese presence in Africa. So if you look in South Africa, for example, South Africa has a much deeper history of Chinese presence in Africa, in South Africa, with Chinese South African communities. So in South Africa, for example, you would find artists who are South African with Chinese heritage who work as very independent artists. I think with Zambia, you really would need to look at the different historical ways of Chinese presence. I think that answers the question.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We are over time. So I just want to give a huge thank you to our speakers for such an enriching and invigorating session, and to all our speakers over the last 3 days, and to everyone who joined us this week. So a reminder that all 3 days of talks will be available on the YouTube channels and websites of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art and National Museum of Asian Art within the next month. We invite you to stay in touch, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Thank you.